Pathfinder Kingmaker feels like a game from a different generation. There may have been plenty of other crowd-funded isometric RPGs released in recent years that draw inspiration from, look like, or have similar gameplay to the RPGs of old, but Pathfinder Kingmaker really is something else. It follows a completely different design philosophy, one that's focused on translating the pen and paper rule set of Pathfinder as accurately as possible instead of following modern RPG or video game conventions. The result is something that very much resembles Baldur's Gate 1, something that can be confusing and frustrating to players unfamiliar to the genre or the rule set the game is based on, something that can seem overly demanding and overly punishing and often unbalanced. But it's also something that's rewarding, that doesn't just allow you to level up and become more powerful, but makes you earn each level and appreciate each increase of power. Pathfinder Kingmaker truly captures the spirit of adventuring, and the result is an experience that is deep and fun and very interesting, but also definitely isn't for everyone. This review will try to explain why that is. There'll be no spoilers, footage will only show the first 2 chapters, and this video will be designed to inform someone who hasn't played the game whether this is a game that's for them and whether it's worth buying. First, let's get some of the obvious things out of the way. This game is based on Pathfinder, which is a pen and paper role-playing game based on Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition. So it's like D&D, but different. Except that difference is quite small, at least at a glance, and the setting in particular feels straight out of a D&D campaign. The gameplay is not turn-based. Instead, it uses a real-time with pause combat system, similar to Baldur's Gate or Pillars of Eternity. If you're unfamiliar with that type of combat system, it can take some getting used to. Expect lots of micromanaging, complicated tooltips, and attacks based off dice rolls that seem to miss far more often than they hit. Those dice rolls are important. You can hover over the combat log to see them in more detail, and they'll play a big part both in combat and outside of it. That means there will be some RNG involved, with one big crit being enough to win or lose a fight at times. And also, the ability to save and load creates a fundamental change from pen and paper games that alters the experience. Outside of combat, you'll spend most of your time in dialogue or moving around the world map. Dialogue involves some player choice that can lead to different consequences, but this probably isn't an RPG you should play if you're only interested in the story. The story isn't bad, particularly once you get past the somewhat slow first chapter, but it still feels like a secondary part of the game, behind the gameplay. The setting and certain plot elements can feel a bit generic, but if there's one strength to the story, it's that it feels like it's your story. You don't just get to make decisions along the way, but you also get to work your way up from a level 1 adventurer to the ruler of your own land. And a few clever plot hooks make the story feel quite personal. Along your journey you'll meet several companions, who are handled in a very traditional way. They'll become walking encyclopedias when telling you about the elements of their backstory if you talk to them. They have some banter with each other at camp, they'll interject in conversations to tell you their opinion, but not as often as you might wish, and they each have their own side quests designed to give them a bit of character development. Overall, they're honestly quite the annoying bunch, with many being whiny or stupid, but at least you can call them out on their stupidity, and with 11 companions to choose from you can always ignore whoever annoys you the most. And that seems somewhat deliberate. The companions seem designed to be quite light-hearted, and there can be some fun moments between them, even if you dislike them, or perhaps particularly if you dislike them. I mentioned the world map already, and you will spend quite a bit of time on it. That's not because there's lots to do, it's more because you move around really slowly, but it's still nice to have a world map. You can find new places to explore, there are random encounters, and the addition of a world map helps make the setting feel more real and interesting. There's also the kingdom management side of the game. This is one of the most unique things about Pathfinder Kingmaker, and it's surprisingly detailed. There's a lot to do and many choices to make. It comes down to raising several stats through creating buildings and sending advisors on missions, but it's quite fleshed out, far more so than say the stronghold in Pillars of Eternity. It's also directly connected to the game's main story, and the management side of it really makes you feel invested in your kingdom and its growth. So that covers a basic overview of the game, but it doesn't explain why this game can be so divisive. Well, the simplest reason for that is because Pathfinder Kingmaker doesn't explain its rules and systems very well. It's not good at teaching new players. Information you may want isn't always in-game, and some explanations that are in-game aren't very clear. Right from the start, you're dumped into character creation with a fantastic amount of options to choose from, but very little in the way of guidance to help you decide. You can hover over abilities to get tooltips which explain them, but those explanations will likely also have things you don't understand in them, and there's no way to hover over anything mentioned in the tooltip. Not sure what every abbreviation means? Don't know what a term like flanking is actually defined as? Well, get used to either googling things or being unsure, because this will happen all the time. Some tooltips are just woefully lacking in information. Take those of permanent ability damage debuffs. That word permanent looks pretty intimidating, but really these can be removed with a low level spell or enough resting, if you know to do so at least. And talking about lacking in information brings us to the biggest offender in player confusion: monsters. There is an encyclopedia in-game, but it doesn't come with any stats. Some of these stats, like damage reduction, can be very important. There is an in-game tutorial message for damage reduction, but you don't see it until you find some skeletons, and you'll have fought plenty of enemies with damage reduction before that. Some enemies have some pretty obvious weaknesses, like trolls' lack of intelligence making them weak to certain spells. But again, you have no way of finding this out in-game other than trial, error, and a little bit of common sense and luck. Then you have certain things that require more than just a bit of common sense, like swarms. These are a special enemy type unique to Pathfinder that can't be hit by any normal weapon or conventional attacks. Instead, they can only be hurt through magic or AoE, making them tricky to take out. So it'd be a shame if the game places some spider swarms in your path on one of the first side quests in game, which it does, and this led to many complaints and confused players. In fact, even if you know what swarms are, it's still a very challenging fight early in the game, as you won't have many means of damaging these swarms, even if you do know how to do so. And, in a sense, those spider swarms sum up the Pathfinder Kingmaker experience. Expect challenges that require you to learn about the rule set to overcome, and don't expect everything you find to be beatable yet. There are some encounters you can find at low level that could never be beaten by a low level group, and some that are very challenging and are best approached by coming back to later, once you have 1 or 2 more levels to your name. And that challenge, and the need to think about your approach, or the ability to find things beyond your capabilities, is part of the appeal. But it's not something that will appeal to everyone, and the lack of information can make the challenge become frustrating when you don't understand what you're doing wrong. However, it's worth noting that the 2 biggest offenders for early player problems have been addressed by the developers. These are the spider swarms, which now come with an explanation from the quest giver and a tutorial message about swarms, and the bear-treant, which has had its damage reduction reduced to be more reasonable. Both were patched on the 28th of September, and so it's clear the developers are paying attention, and are trying to balance between making the game challenging without being flat out unfair. But, if you aren't familiar with the Pathfinder rule set, expect to have a tough time. And if you don't have any familiarity with Dungeons & Dragons, or the classic RPGs of old that this game takes its inspiration from, you should ask yourself if this game is really for you. There is a lot to read and a lot to take in, and the game doesn't always feel like the best teacher. Of course, there are different difficulty settings that are highly customizable, and if you are new to the genre, this could help ease you in, but you should still know what you're getting yourself in for. The learning curve and lack of information aren't the game's only problems though. There are some nice quality of life additions, such as pausing on trap detection, but there are some other things that are missing here. By far the most important of these are a button to speed up time when moving, and the ability to respec. Characters move slow, and speeding up time feels badly needed. And in a game with high difficulty and hugely customizable characters, the inability to respec can make your choices feel very punishing if you take some things you later regret, which you almost definitely will. It's hard to say the game feels incredibly polished either. There are several spelling mistakes, and you'll see plenty of small visual bugs. As for more serious bugs, crashing and long load times, I haven't encountered any of these in the many hours I've played since release, but plenty of other people have, and it seems these are problems that affect some people more than others. There's also a feeling that the game isn't always balanced, which may partly because players don't understand everything, but could also be because the game just isn't that well balanced. The developers do seem to be working hard to address this, but the feeling of unbalance and things being poorly explained isn't limited to the early sections. If anything, it only gets worse once the kingdom management and world events are added, and some people have been forced to load earlier saves to prevent their kingdom being destroyed, as this scenario is easier to end up in than you'd expect. So this game definitely isn't for everyone. It's challenging and complex, and asks a hell of a lot from the player. There is a lot to learn, and the game is a bad teacher, but if you stick with it, you get an experience that's deep and rewarding in a way that few other RPGs are. More than anything, this game captures the feeling of role-playing and adventuring. It forces you to start at level 1 and then make sure you understand just how weak you are, but each level you receive feels earned through hard work, and by the time you get a barony you feel you deserve it. And things only get more intense from there. The game isn't always balanced, and it isn't all that polished, and if you are even slightly unsure on whether it's for you, you may want to wait and let the game get a few more patches so you have a smoother experience. One where the most egregious balance issues have been fixed, and where you're less likely to run into any serious bugs. But you shouldn't ignore this game. This game is special. It doesn't feel at all like most other modern RPGs, and whether that's good or bad is down to the player, but at the very least this game deserves attention for being different. And I hope this review helps it get that, and helps people to know whether it's a game that's for them, because it's certainly not a game that's for everyone. And if you're still unsure, go watch a Let's Play and just watch the character creation and use that as a litmus test. Do all the options and tooltips you need to read to understand those options excite you, or are they off-putting? Because asking yourself that one question may tell you all you need to know whether Pathfinder Kingmaker is a game you'll enjoy. And if you do decide to get it, be careful of the spider swarms. And fuck those wolves. And don't even go near the were-rats. And don't rest at that one camp. Fuck those bandits too. And those might priests, Jesus. And the kobold alchemists, little shits. Who fucking even taught them this stuff? And fuck that owlbear. And that doom spider. And fucking hell, those wargs. And that bandit leader. Why is that one bandit leader so fucking strong? Jesus. I thought I could kill bandits by this time.